August 10th, 991. The morning mist clung to the Blackwater estuary in Essex as Ealdorman Byrhtnoth, a man of 60 years with silver hair cascading past his shoulders, stood on the muddy banks and watched the dragon ships beach themselves on Northey Island. The old warrior, towering at nearly 7 feet tall according to the examination of his remains centuries later, had seen Viking raiders before. He had fought them. He had killed them. But this morning, as he counted the longships disgorging their cargo of Scandinavian warriors onto English soil, he understood that something different was unfolding. This wasn't a raid. This was an invasion force, and they had come to Maldon with a specific purpose, to bleed England of silver or blood, preferably both. The Viking army that assembled on Northey Island that August morning numbered somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 warriors, though exact figures remain lost to history. What we do know from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and the magnificent but fragmentary poem that memorialises this battle is that these weren't desperate outcasts or opportunistic pirates. These were professional warriors, many of them veterans of campaigns across the North Sea world. They wore mail shirts that had turned aside Saxon spears in a dozen battles. They carried swords with pattern-welded blades that had been handed down through generations. They were led by men whose names struck fear across England, though the poem tantalizingly never identifies their leader by name, referring to him only as the Viking messenger and the Viking earl. Byrhtnoth had been Ealdorman of Essex since 956, serving 3 kings over 35 years. He was a warrior aristocrat of the old school, a man who had risen to power in the brutal politics of 10th century England through a combination of military skill, political acumen, and the kind of personal courage that inspired men to follow him into the Shieldwall. He held vast estates across Essex, Suffolk, and beyond. He had endowed monasteries, witnessed royal charters, and commanded armies. But on this August morning, all of his wealth, all of his political connections, all of his experience meant nothing. What mattered was the quality of his warriors and his own tactical decisions in the hours ahead. The geography of the battlefield dictated everything that would follow. Northey Island sits in the Blackwater estuary, separated from the mainland by a narrow causeway that floods at high tide but becomes passable at low tide. The causeway was perhaps 80 yards long and only wide enough for 2 or 3 men to walk abreast. It was a perfect defensive position, a natural choke point that turned the Vikings' numerical advantage into a liability. Any attack across that causeway would have to come in a narrow column, unable to deploy their full strength, vulnerable to missiles and spear thrusts from defenders who could mass their forces at the causeway's end. Byrhtnoth deployed his fyrd, the militia force of Essex, along the causeway approach and the river bank. These weren't professional soldiers in the modern sense, but they weren't untrained peasants either. The fyrd system required able-bodied freemen to serve in military campaigns and to maintain their weapons. Many of Byrhtnoth's men had fought before, perhaps against Viking raiders or in the petty conflicts between English lords. They carried spears, the primary weapon of Anglo-Saxon warfare, shields made of lime wood covered in leather, and sea-axes, the long knives that gave the Saxons their name. The wealthier among them wore mail shirts. A few, the Thegns and household warriors who formed Byrhtnoth's personal retinue, carried swords, expensive weapons that mark their status as professional fighting men. The poem that preserves the battle's memory, composed within living memory of the event, gives us the names of many of these men. Wulfstan, described as fierce in battle. Elfnoth and Wulfmare, who stood at the causeway's end. Eskfirth, Edwiald, Oswald and Ealdwald, brothers who would not flee. Leofsunu, who swore to avenge his lord or die trying. Godric, who owned the horse that would later cause such confusion. These weren't faceless soldiers. They were individuals with families, with property, with lives they knew might end before sunset. As the tide receded, the causeway emerged from the water like a bridge between 2 worlds. On one side stood the English, defenders of their land, subjects of King Ethelred, Christians who saw these Northmen as heathen invaders, even though many Vikings by 91 had converted to Christianity. On the other side stood the Vikings, warriors who had crossed the North Sea seeking glory and gold, men who lived by a code that valued courage above all else and promised a place in Valhalla for those who fell in battle. The Vikings tested the causeway first. A small group advanced, shields raised, probing for weakness. Wulfstan, son of Tiola, met them at the causeway's end. The poem describes him as a champion among the Kentish men and his prowess proved the description accurate. The first Viking to reach solid ground felt a Wulfstan's spear, then another. The causeway ran red with blood as body after body was hurled back into the mud and water. The Vikings couldn't deploy their numbers, they couldn't flank, they couldn't bring their tactical sophistication to bear. The causeway negated everything that made them dangerous. After losing men to Wulfstan's spear and the missiles raining down from the English line, the Vikings withdrew to Northey Island to reconsider. They had a problem. The tide would turn, the causeway would flood, they would be trapped on a small island with no food, no water, and an English army that could be reinforced while they starved. They needed to cross, but crossing meant suicide against the determined defence. What happened next became the most controversial decision in Anglo-Saxon military history, and the turning point that doomed Byrhtnoth and his army. A Viking messenger called across the water with an offer. The poem preserves his words in elegant, formal language. The Vikings demanded tribute, gold and silver in exchange for peace. Pay us, and we will return to our ships and leave your land untouched. Refuse, and we will paint this field with English blood. Byrhtnoth's response has echoed through English history for over 1,000 years. He rejected the offer with contempt. The poem has him declare that spears and ancient swords would settle the tribute, that battle gear would be the gold he offered, that the Vikings would have to win their treasure through combat. Then, and this is where historical debate rages, Byrhtnoth made his fatal choice. He ordered his men to withdraw from the causeway and allow the Vikings to cross to the mainland for a fair fight. Why would an experienced military commander surrender a perfect defensive position? The poem suggests overmod, a complex Old English word that means something between pride, overconfidence, and excessive courage. Later chroniclers called it foolish. Some modern historians argue he had no choice, that perhaps Viking ships threatened to land elsewhere, forcing him to meet them in open battle anyway. Others suggest the Viking messenger shamed him, implying that hiding behind a causeway was cowardly, unworthy of a great warrior. Still others proposed that Byrhtnoth, a man of 60 who had lived a life of violence and warfare, simply wanted the glory of a pitched battle, the kind of fight that songs would remember. Whatever his reasoning, Byrhtnoth gave the order. The English withdrew from the causeway. The Vikings, surely unable to believe their fortune, began to cross. They came in formation, shields locked, moving cautiously at first in case this was a trap. But it wasn't a trap. It was an invitation to slaughter, though who would do the slaughtering remained to be seen. Once across, the Vikings deployed into their battle formation. This is where we must rely on our understanding of Viking Age warfare to reconstruct what happened, because the poem focuses on individual combat and heroic stands rather than tactical formations. The Vikings almost certainly formed their Skjaldborg, their shield wall, a formation that had conquered kingdoms and terrorized Europe for 2 centuries. The shield wall wasn't what Hollywood often depicts, a static line of men standing shoulder to shoulder. It was a dynamic, fluid formation that required immense discipline and experience to maintain. Warriors stood close enough that their round shields overlapped, creating a mobile barrier. The front rank held spears overhand or underhand, thrusting at enemies while the shield wall protected them. The second rank could thrust over their shoulders or provide weight to push forward. The third and subsequent ranks served as reserves, ready to step into gaps when front rank warriors fell. The psychological impact of a shield wall was as important as its physical protection. The sound alone was terrifying. Hundreds of warriors beating spears against shields, chanting, bellowing war cries. The Vikings were experts at psychological warfare. They knew that many battles were decided before the first blow landed, when one side's courage broke and men fled rather than face the grinding horror of close combat. The Anglo-Saxons formed their own shield wall facing the Vikings. Byrhtnoth positioned himself in the centre, the place of honour and greatest danger. His household warriors, the Harthriorodu, stood with him. These were professional fighters who had sworn oaths of loyalty, men who owed Byrhtnoth everything, and who would die before abandoning him. Around them stood the Thengs, the warrior aristocracy of Essex. On the flanks were the feared, brave men but less experienced, less heavily armed, more likely to break under pressure. The 2 shield walls faced each other across 100 yards of marshy ground near the river. This was the moment when experienced warriors checked their equipment one final time. Shield grips were tested, spear hafts were examined for cracks, helmet straps were tightened, Men urinated where they stood because leaving the formation meant death. Some prayed to Christ, some thought of their families, some simply focused on the back of the man in front of them, knowing that survival depended on maintaining formation. Byrhtnoth, despite his age, despite his silver hair, was said to have arranged his men personally. The poem describes him riding along the line, showing men their positions, teaching them how to hold shields properly, how to stand firm. He dismounted and sent his horse to the rear. A great lord fighting on foot alongside his men, this was leadership in the Germanic warrior tradition. Kings and earls who demanded loyalty proved their worth by sharing the danger. The missile exchange began first. Javelins arced through the air from both sides. The Vikings called these weapons adgaia, and they were designed to punch through shields and mail. The Anglo-Saxons had their own throwing spears, lighter weapons that could be hurled 60 or 70 yards before the formations closed. Arrows from the few archers present hissed overhead. Men fell, struck by missiles before the real killing began. Those who could be saved were dragged to the rear. Those too badly wounded were left to die between the lines, their screams haunting the survivors. Then the shield walls advanced toward each other. This wasn't a wild charge. It was a measured, deliberate approach. Experienced warriors knew that running into combat exhausted you, made you vulnerable, broke formation. The key was to maintain the shield wall integrity until the moment of impact. The Vikings beat their shields rhythmically, creating a sound like thunder. The Anglo-Saxons responded with their own battle cries. The poem preserves one warrior shouting about the slaughter of kinsmen, personal motivation driving him toward vengeance. The collision of shield walls produced a sound unlike anything in modern warfare. Imagine hundreds of wooden shields smashing together simultaneously, spears thrusting, men screaming, the crack of breaking wood, the wet sound of blades finding flesh. The front ranks pushed against each other, shields overlapping, each side trying to drive the other back. Spears thrust over and under shields, men stabbed at legs, at faces, at any exposed flesh. The second rank pushed forward, adding their weight to the scrum. This wasn't elegant sword fighting from movies. This was brutal, exhausting, horrifying close-quarters combat. Warriors stood so close they could smell their enemy's breath, see the fear or fury in their eyes. Men slipped in blood and mud. Wounded warriors were trampled by those behind them. The noise was deafening, overwhelming, a chaos of screams and curses in Old English and Old Norse. The shield walls ground against each other, neither side gaining advantage. This was what both sides expected. Battles between experienced forces, often stalemates for hours. Warriors rotated out of the front rank when exhausted, replaced by fresh men from behind. The killing was steady but not decisive. A man here, a man there, falling to spear thrusts or axes finding gaps in shields. Byrhtnoth fought in the centre of his line, his great height making him visible across the battlefield. The poem describes him encouraging his warriors, reminding them of their oaths, their honour, their duty. At 60 years old, he wielded his weapons with the skill of a lifetime spent in violence. He wounded a Viking warrior, driving him back. He rallied his men when they wavered. Then disaster struck the English line. A Viking warrior, the poem doesn't name him, hurled a spear with deadly accuracy. It caught Byrhtnoth in the shoulder, the kind of wound that in the 10th century was often fatal even if not immediately so. The great ealdorman, feeling the spear strike home, grabbed the shaft and threw it back, killing the Viking who had wounded him. But he was weakened now, bleeding, his shield arm compromised. The Viking, sensing opportunity, pressed forward. Warriors surged toward Byrhtnoth, knowing that killing the English commander would break the army's will to fight. 2 more spears struck him. The poem describes him thanking God for all the joys he had experienced in his life, a final prayer before death. Then Viking warriors closed in for the kill. They hacked at him with swords and axes. The towering ealdorman, the silver-haired warrior who had served 3 kings, fell to the bloody ground. His death should have ended the battle. In Germanic warrior culture, when the lord fell, his warriors were released from their oaths. They could flee without dishonour, having fought loyally until their leader died. Many battles in this period ended when one side's leader was killed, the army dissolving as men sought to save their own lives. Some of Byrhtnoth's men did flee. The poem names them with contempt, particularly Godric, son of Odda. who grabbed Bertnoth's horse and rode away from the battlefield. This caused confusion among the English ranks, because men saw what they thought was their commander fleeing, not realizing it was a coward on his lord's mount. Other warriors followed this apparent retreat, the shield wall beginning to fragment. But Bertnoth's household warriors, his oath-sworn companions, made a different choice. They decided to die with their lord, to fulfill their oaths even in death. This decision transformed a military defeat into something approaching legend, a last stand that would be remembered in poetry and inspire warriors for generations. The poem shifts its focus to these doomed heroes, preserving their names and their final words for eternity. Elfwine, a young warrior of good family, shouted to the others about honour and shame, reminding them of all the boasts they had made in the mead hall when drunk and safe. Now was the time to prove those boasts true. He promised to avenge his lord or die trying. Offa, another Thegn, spoke next. He praised Elfwine's words and added his own vow. He would not retreat even a foot from the battlefield. He would advance or fall where he stood. Then he went forward to die. Leofsnu raised his shield and declared that he would not flee, that he would advance in his lord's service, that no man in Sturma, his home village, would accuse him of cowardice. He threw himself back into the battle. Dunna, an old farmer described as a simple churl, called out to all the warriors, demanding they avenge Bertnoth without hesitation. Even a man of a low birth could show courage that shamed nobles. The poem gives us these speeches, these final declarations of intent, and they reveal the warrior culture that underpinned Anglo-Saxon society. Honour mattered more than life. Reputation transcended death. A man who fled lived with shame forever. A man who died bravely achieved a kind of immortality through poetry and memory. The household warriors formed a defensive circle around Bertnoth's body. This wasn't a shield wall anymore. This was a last stand, a deliberate choice to die fighting rather than live with dishonour. The Vikings surrounded them, recognizing what was happening. In some ways, the Vikings respected this choice. Their own culture venerated courage above all else. These English warriors were dying the right way, weapon in hand, facing their enemies. But respect didn't mean mercy. The Vikings pressed their attack. They had already won. The English army was broken. Many had fled. Victory was assured, but these stubborn English warriors wouldn't surrender, so they had to be killed. Every single one. Eskfirth fell, son of Ecglaf, fighting beside his comrades. Godric, not the coward, but another man with the same name, died bravely. Etheric and Wulfmare fell within seconds of each other. Offa was cut down after killing several Vikings. One by one, the circle shrank. As warriors fell, the poem focuses on individual combat now, describing how each warrior died. Edwild fought on the wounded. Oswald fought until overwhelmed. The brothers Ealdwald and Godwyn refused to flee, choosing death beside their lord. Bertwald, an old warrior, white-haired and experienced, delivered what became the most famous speech in the poem. He declared that as strength diminishes, courage must increase. As might lessons, resolve must grow. He would die beside his lord, and no man would accuse him of cowardice. Then Bertwald went forward and was killed. The last of Bertnoth's household warriors died as the afternoon shadows lengthened. The Vikings stood among the corpses, bloodied, exhausted, victorious but sobered by the courage they had witnessed. They had won. England had lost. But the English warriors had shown what later generations would call the Anglo-Saxon spirit, stubborn resistance even in certain defeat. The battle's immediate aftermath was brutal. The Vikings stripped the dead of armour and weapons, valuable equipment that could be reused or sold. They took whatever gold and silver the dead carried. They left the bodies for the English to recover, a small gesture of respect perhaps, or simply because they had no use for corpses. The survivors of the English fyrd who had fled brought news of the disaster to the rest of Essex, and to King Ethelred in Winchester. Bertnoth was dead. The army was destroyed. Essex lay open to Viking depredation. The news spread panic. If a great ealdorman with a trained army could be defeated so completely, what hope did anyone else have? The Vikings didn't immediately ravage Essex. They had proven their point. They could defeat English armies. They could kill English nobles. Now they wanted their tribute. Messengers went to King Ethelred with a simple proposition. Pay us to leave, or we will burn your kingdom. Ethelred, later called the Unready, a mistranslation of unread meaning ill-advised, made the choice that would define his reign. He paid. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that £10,000 of silver were given to the Vikings to buy peace. This was the first of the Dongelds, the protection money that would flow from England to Scandinavia for the next 25 years, enriching Vikings and impoverishing England. The decision to pay rather than fight was pragmatic. Ethelred had lost one army at Maldon. Raising another would take time. The Vikings could raid with impunity while he gathered forces. Better to pay them to leave and rebuild defences. But the decision had consequences beyond the immediate tactical situation. It taught the Vikings that England would pay. It encouraged more Viking fleets to cross the North Sea seeking profit. It created a cycle of raid, payment, temporary peace, then more raids. More profoundly, it damaged English morale. Byrhtnoth and his men had died fighting. They had shown courage, loyalty, and martial prowess. And for what? So that their king could give the Vikings silver anyway. Their sacrifice seemed meaningless. The contrast between Byrhtnoth's heroic last stand and Ethelred's craven payment burned in the English consciousness. The monks at Ely Abbey recovered Byrhtnoth's body from the battlefield. The Vikings had decapitated him, taking his head as a trophy, a common practice for important enemies. The monks brought his headless corpse back to Ely for burial. He was interred with honour, and his grave became a site of pilgrimage. When his tomb was opened in 1769, his skeleton confirmed the poem's description of his great height, nearly 7 feet tall, and showed the wounds that killed him. The poem about the battle was composed soon after, perhaps within a generation. We don't know the poet's name or exactly when he wrote, but the detail suggests he spoke with survivors or knew the story intimately. The poem exists in a single manuscript that was damaged in a fire in 1731, burning away the beginning and end. What survives, 325 lines in Old English, is a masterpiece of early medieval literature. The poem's purpose was clear: to commemorate the fallen, to praise their courage, and to establish what behaviour was honourable in defeat. The poem damns the cowards by name. Godric, son of Odda, will be remembered forever as a man who fled. It praises the brave by name. Bertwold's final speech became a defining statement of Anglo-Saxon warrior values. The poem turned military disaster into cultural triumph, showing that how you die matters more than whether you win or lose. The Battle of Maldon's influence on English culture extended far beyond 991. The poem was copied and studied for centuries. Medieval warriors learned from it what courage meant. Priests used it to discuss honour and duty. Scholars analysed its language and artistry. Even today, over 1,000 years later, historians debate Byrhtnoth's decisions and the poem's meaning. The battle also marked a turning point in English history. After Maldon, the Vikings understood that England could be conquered not through single raids but through sustained pressure. The Danegelds financed larger armies. Within 25 years, King Swene Forkbeard of Denmark would invade and briefly conquer England. His son Knut would rule England, Denmark, and Norway as an empire. The path to this conquest began on the muddy banks of the Blackwater where Byrhtnoth fell. The tactical lessons of Maldon were debated by military minds for generations. Should Byrhtnoth have held the causeway? Obviously yes, from a pure military standpoint. The Vikings would have been forced to withdraw or starve. But this ignores the political reality. If Byrhtnoth had cowered behind the causeway, his reputation would have suffered. Other Vikings would have raided elsewhere, knowing he wouldn't fight. The king might have questioned his courage. In the warrior culture of 10th century England, sometimes military advantage had to be sacrificed for honour. The shield wall tactics displayed at Maldon represented the culmination of centuries of Germanic warfare evolution. The formation required discipline, courage, and extensive training to maintain. When it held, it was nearly unbeatable. When it broke, as the English line did after Byrhtnoth fell, it led to catastrophic defeat. The Vikings had perfected shield wall warfare through generations of raiding and conquest. The Anglo-Saxons had learned from them, adopting similar tactics. Maldon was a collision of two cultures that shared military traditions, spoke related languages, and understood each other's values even as they killed each other. The weapons used at Maldon were products of sophisticated metallurgy. Viking swords particularly were marvels of engineering. Pattern welding involved twisting and forging different types of iron and steel together, creating blades that were both flexible and hard, capable of holding an edge through prolonged combat. These swords were expensive, requiring weeks of skilled labour. They had names and histories, Warriors passed them down through generations. To lose your sword in battle was a profound disgrace. The spears carried by most warriors were simpler but no less effective. A spear required less metal than a sword, used cheaper materials, and could be produced by any competent blacksmith. The spear's reach advantage in formation fighting made it the primary killing weapon. A skilled spearman could thrust from behind the shield wall, kill his opponent, and withdraw before counterattack. Spears broke frequently, which is why warriors carried multiple weapons. The shields that gave the shield wall its name were works of craftsmanship themselves. Limewood was preferred for its lightweight and ability to absorb impacts without shattering. A shield might be 2 or 3 feet in diameter, covered in leather, painted with geometric designs or warriors' personal symbols. The iron boss in the centre protected the hand grip and could be used offensively to punch opponents. Shields were disposable in battle, expected to be hacked to pieces, which is why wealthy warriors brought extras. The mail shirts worn by nobles and household warriors represented enormous wealth. A single mail shirt required thousands of individual iron rings, each one forged, shaped, and linked by hand. The labour involved meant a mail shirt cost as much as a farm. Only the wealthy could afford them, which is why most furred warriors fought in leather armour or padded cloth. Mail wasn't impenetrable. A strong thrust could drive rings into flesh or break them, but it provided excellent protection against slashing attacks and deflected most arrows. The psychological dimension of shield wall combat cannot be overstated. Modern people have difficulty comprehending the courage required to stand in formation, while enemies approach with intent to kill you. Every instinct screams to run. Your bowels loosen. Your mouth goes dry. Your heart pounds so hard you think it will burst, and yet you must stand because running means death, either from enemies who will chase you down or from your own side who will kill you as a coward. The men at Maldon who held formation, who advanced when ordered, who died at their posts, these men overcame the most fundamental human instinct for survival. The Viking perspective on Maldon is lost to us. They won, but they didn't write poems celebrating the victory. Viking culture was oral, and while they certainly had skalds composing verses about the battle, none survived. We can infer from their actions that they respected English courage. They gave Byrhtnoth a warrior's death. They didn't mutilate all the bodies, just took the heads of important leaders as trophies, a practice both sides engaged in. They negotiated rather than continuing to ravage Essex, suggesting they preferred silver to more fighting. The Vikings who fought at Maldon were products of a warrior culture every bit as sophisticated as the Anglo-Saxon. Young men trained from childhood in weapons, in tactics, in the sagas that taught them how heroes behaved. A Viking warrior was expected to be brave, loyal to his lord, generous with treasure to his followers, and ambitious for glory. The shield wall was their tool for achieving these goals, a formation that let individual courage contribute to collective victory. The religious dimension of Maldon adds another layer of meaning. The poem portrays the battle as Christians versus heathens, though by 991 many Vikings had converted to Christianity, at least nominally. The poem has Byrhtnoth thanking God before dying, framing his death as martyrdom in service of a Christian king against pagan invaders. This religious framing intensified the poem's impact on medieval audiences, transforming military defeat into spiritual victory. The economic impact of Maldon reverberated through England for decades. The £10,000 of silver paid after the battle was an enormous sum, requiring taxation across the kingdom. This burden fell on farmers, craftsmen, merchants, everyone who couldn't avoid the tax collectors. The Danegeld became an annual tribute, each year draining more wealth from England to Scandinavia. Archaeological evidence shows this flow of silver, English coins found in massive hoards across Scandinavia, burial goods of Viking warriors enriched by English tribute. The political consequences were equally significant. Ethelred's decision to pay undermined his authority. English nobles questioned his leadership. Why should they risk their lives fighting Vikings when the king would just pay them anyway? This erosion of confidence in royal leadership contributed to England's eventual conquest by Sweyn Forkbeard and Nut. Maldon didn't directly cause this conquest, but it began the process of English demoralisation that made conquest possible. The site of the Battle of Maldon today is peaceful farmland and tidal marshes. The causeway still exists, still floods at high tide, still connects Northay Island to the mainland. Visitors can walk the ground where warriors died over 1,000 years ago. Archaeological investigations have found weapons and equipment, physical remnants of the slaughter. The town of Maldon maintains the battle's memory, recognizing that this moment of defeat defined something essential about English identity. The legacy of Maldon in English literature extends far beyond the original poem. Later medieval writers referenced it as an exemplar of courage in defeat. Victorian poets rediscovered it and incorporated its themes into their work. Modern scholars analyse it as a window into Anglo-Saxon society, military tactics, and cultural values. The poem has been translated dozens of times, each generation finding new meanings in the ancient words. August 10th, 991 began with an old warrior making a controversial decision, and ended with his headless corpse on a battlefield soaked in blood. Between those moments, hundreds of men discovered what they were made of when facing death. Some fled and lived with shame, some stood and died with honour. The Vikings won silver and went home, the Anglo-Saxons lost their leader and paid tribute. But the poem transformed this military disaster into cultural triumph, proving that courage and loyalty matter more than victory, that how you die defines you more than how you live, and that sometimes the defeated are remembered more fondly than the victors. The Shieldwalls clashed that day at Maldon, and when they parted, England had lost a battle, but gained a legend that would inspire warriors for the next 1,000 years. The immediate days following the Battle of Maldon saw Essex transformed into a landscape of mourning and fear. The bodies of the fallen were recovered by monks and local villagers who ventured onto the battlefield once the Vikings withdrew to their ships. The scene that greeted them was nightmarish. Corpses lay in twisted heaps where the shield walls had collided. The ground was churned into bloody mud, littered with broken shields, shattered spears, and the detritus of battle. Severed limbs, discarded mail shirts too damaged to salvage, arrows still protruding from bodies, the physical evidence of violence on a scale most had never witnessed. The recovery effort was organised by the Church, which held significant authority in Anglo-Saxon England. Monks from various monasteries arrived with carts to collect the dead. They sorted bodies, trying to identify nobles and household warriors who deserved burial in consecrated ground from common furred soldiers who might be buried in mass graves. The identification process was grim work. Many bodies were mutilated beyond recognition. The Vikings had taken heads as trophies, stripped armour and weapons, and the fighting itself had disfigured corpses. Monks relied on clothing remnants, distinctive jewellery, or information from survivors to name the dead. Byrhtnoth's body, despite lacking its head, was identified by his extraordinary height and the rich clothing he wore. The monks treated his corpse with special reverence. He was a great patron of Ely Abbey, having granted them lands and treasure over his decades as ealdorman. They transported his body back to Ely with ceremony, singing hymns as they travelled. His widow, Aelflaed, met them at the abbey. She was a formidable woman in her own right, from a powerful family, and her grief was compounded by rage at the Vikings who had killed her husband, and at King Ethelred who would pay them for doing so. The funeral at Ely Abbey was attended by nobles from across eastern England. Byrhtnoth was buried with honours appropriate to his rank, though without his head, which the Vikings presumably kept or discarded. The monks fashioned a head of wax to complete the burial, a common practice when bodies were incomplete. Prayers were said for his soul, his military achievements were recounted, his generosity to the church was praised. But underlying the ceremony was a bitter question that many nobles privately asked. Had Byrhtnoth's decision to allow the Vikings across the causeway been courage or foolishness? Had his overmod, his excessive pride, led to unnecessary death? This debate raged in the halls of English power throughout the autumn of 991. Some defended Byrhtnoth's choice. He had faced an impossible situation. If he held the causeway, the Vikings might have landed elsewhere and ravaged Essex while he sat immobile. If he paid them off without fighting, he would be called a coward. By offering battle, he at least gave his men a chance to fight with honour. His household warrior's last stand proved that English courage matched Viking ferocity. Defeat was not disgrace when you died fighting. Others condemned the decision as the height of aristocratic stupidity. Byrhtnoth had a perfect defensive position and abandoned it for glory. His pride killed hundreds of good men who trusted his leadership. He left Essex defenceless and gave King Ethelred no choice but to pay the Vikings. His romantic notions of heroic combat belonged to poetry, not to the practical business of warfare. A commander's duty was to win, not to die gloriously. By this standard, Byrhtnoth had failed catastrophically. King Ethelred himself likely held mixed feelings. Byrhtnoth had been a loyal servant for decades, a powerful supporter who had helped stabilise Ethelred's often troubled reign. His death removed a pillar of support from the regime, but his defeat also forced Ethelred into paying Danegeld, a decision that would haunt the king for the rest of his life. Ethelred was already struggling with Viking raids across England. Maldon demonstrated that English armies couldn't reliably defeat Viking forces. The payment of tribute seemed the only way to buy time. The collection of £10,000 of silver to pay the Vikings required an enormous mobilisation of English resources. This wasn't coined money sitting in a treasury. This was silver that had to be gathered from across the kingdom. Churches were asked to contribute their plate. Nobles provided silver armourings and jewellery. Taxes were levied on everyone. The effort took months and created enormous resentment. English farmers, watching their silver cups and family heirlooms taken to pay Vikings who had killed their neighbours, understood that something fundamental had broken in England's ability to defend itself. The Vikings who received this treasure returned to their ships and sailed away as promised. But they didn't return to Scandinavia. They sailed to other parts of England and to Normandy, spending their silver, recruiting more warriors, and preparing for future raids. The lesson of Maldon spread quickly through the Viking world. England was rich, and its king would pay rather than fight. This revelation triggered a surge in Viking activity that would last for decades. The psychological impact of Maldon on English society cannot be measured in statistics, but it was profound. A generation of warriors had grown up hearing about Alfred the Great's victories over the Vikings in the late 800s. They believed England could defeat any invader through courage and good leadership. Maldon shattered this confidence. If Byrhtnoth, an experienced warrior with a trained army and a perfect defensive position, could lose so completely, what hope did anyone else have? The Vikings seemed invincible, their warriors superior, their tactics unbeatable. This defeatism infected English military performance for years afterward. When Viking armies appeared, English commanders were hesitant to engage. They remembered Maldon. They knew what happened when Shieldwalls clashed with Viking professionals. Better to negotiate, to pay, to avoid battle. This psychology created a vicious cycle. English armies that expected to lose often did lose. Vikings who expected easy victories usually achieved them. The Battle of Maldon became a self-fulfilling prophecy of English military inadequacy. The poem about Maldon worked against this trend. By celebrating the courage of Byrhtnoth's household warriors, by immortalising their final stands, by establishing that honour in defeat was possible, the poem provided a counter-narrative to simple defeatism. Yes, England lost. Yes, the Vikings won. But English warriors had shown they could fight and die as bravely as any Northman. The poem suggested that the problem wasn't English courage, but English leadership and resources. Better decisions, better preparation, more support from the king, these could change outcomes. The individual stories preserved in the poem took on lives of their own in English culture. Bertwold's final speech became proverbial. His declaration that courage must increase as strength diminishes was quoted in entirely different contexts: political debates, personal challenges, spiritual struggles. The speech transcended its military origins to become a general statement about maintaining resolve in adversity. Medieval monks copied it into manuscripts. Priests quoted it in sermons. Warriors recited it before battles for centuries. The contrast between Godric the coward who fled on Byrhtnoth's horse and the loyal warriors who died fighting became a moral lesson taught to children. Choose your moment of testing carefully because your response will define you forever. Godric's cowardice was remembered 1,000 years later. The brave warriors' names were preserved in poetry. Which reputation would you prefer? This stark choice between eternal shame and eternal honour reflected the warrior culture's obsession with reputation as the only immortality available to mortals. The military analysis of Maldon continued among English commanders trying to understand how to fight Vikings more effectively. Some focused on the shield wall itself, arguing that English formations lacked the discipline of Viking equivalents. Vikings trained together constantly, raiding and fighting as units. English feared armies assembled only when needed, with warriors who might never have fought together before. This lack of cohesion showed when the shield wall was stressed. English formations broke more easily than Viking ones. Others argue the problem was equipment. Viking warriors were generally better armed and armoured than English furred soldiers. The difference between a Viking professional in mail shirt with sword and shield versus an English farmer with spear and wooden shield was significant. Not insurmountable in individual combat, but multiplied across hundreds of warriors, it created cumulative advantage. England needed to invest in better equipment for its militia forces or develop professional standing armies like the Vikings had. Still, others identified leadership as the key variable. Byrhtnoth was 60 years old, brave, but perhaps not as tactically flexible as younger commanders. His decision to abandon the causeway suggested someone more concerned with honour than victory. England needed commanders who thought strategically, who were willing to use terrain, avoid pitched battles when necessary, and employ ambush and harassment rather than always seeking the heroic confrontation. This analysis was prescient, but difficult to implement in a culture that valued battlefield courage above cunning. The Vikings themselves learned lessons from Maldon that influenced their subsequent campaigns. They had won, but the English household warriors' last stand had impressed them. The Vikings lost more men than they expected in the final slaughter around Byrhtnoth's body. English warriors, properly motivated and led, could be formidable opponents. The Vikings also noted how quickly the English shield wall collapsed once Byrhtnoth fell. Killing the commander became a priority in future battles. Take out the leader and the army evaporates. The tactical use of the causeway by the English showed the Vikings the importance of controlling terrain. In subsequent campaigns, Vikings were more careful about battlefield selection. They avoided situations where they could be channeled into narrow approaches. They scouted more carefully. They used their mobility advantage provided by their ships to choose when and where to fight. Maldon taught them that English commanders might occasionally make smart tactical decisions, so Vikings needed to be smarter. The religious institutions of England, particularly monasteries, had complicated responses to Maldon. On one hand, they praised Byrhtnoth as a Christian hero fighting heathen invaders. His patronage of churches, his piety, his final prayer before death, all marked him as a defender of the faith. The monks who received his body treated him almost as a martyr. Some claimed miracles at his tomb, though these were never officially recognised by the church hierarchy. On the other hand, monks and bishops had to live with the practical consequences of the battle. The Danegeld paid to the Vikings came partially from church wealth. Monasteries contributed silver plate and treasures. This wasn't voluntary charity but forced extraction. The church resented paying Vikings to leave England when that money could have funded more warriors to fight them. Some church leaders quietly criticised Byrhtnoth's tactical decisions, arguing that better generalship would have avoided the need for tribute. The monasteries also had to deal with increased Viking raiding after Maldon. Once Vikings understood that England would pay, they returned repeatedly. Monasteries were prime targets because they held concentrated wealth. Churches built in the decades after Maldon often included fortifications, defensive towers where treasures could be hidden and monks could retreat during raids. This militarization of religious architecture showed how fundamentally Viking pressure changed English society. The women of Anglo-Saxon England experienced Maldon's consequences in ways rarely recorded but deeply significant. Elfleid, Byrhtnoth's widow, lost not just a husband, but political power and economic security. As an ealdorman's wife, she had wielded considerable influence. After his death, that influence evaporated. She retained some lands and wealth, but younger male relatives or the king's appointees took over Byrhtnoth's political role. Women in Anglo-Saxon England could inherit and control property, but they operated in a fundamentally male-dominated political structure. Warfare killed men and marginalised women. The wives and mothers of the warriors who died at Maldon faced similar losses. A dead husband meant economic hardship for families. Farms lost their labourers. Businesses lost their craftsmen. Children lost fathers. The social safety net in 10th century England was limited. Widows might remarry if young enough, but older women often ended up dependent on relatives or the church's charity. The Battle of Maldon killed hundreds of men and created hundreds of widows and orphans struggling to survive. Some women's experiences of Maldon were even darker. After battles, Vikings sometimes enslaved captives rather than killing them. English warriors who survived wounds might be taken as slaves. More commonly, Vikings raiding after the battle took women and children. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and later sources mention English slaves sold in Viking markets in Dublin, York, and Scandinavia. Being captured in a Viking raid meant a life of forced labour, sexual exploitation, and separation from family forever. These human consequences of Maldon rarely appear in heroic poetry, but were real and devastating. The economic disruption caused by Maldon and subsequent Viking activity created inflation and hardship across England. The kingdom's silver supply, already limited, was drained by Danegeld payments. This created monetary shortage. With less silver in circulation, trade became more difficult. Prices increased for imported goods. Local markets contracted. The English economy, which had been growing steadily through the 10th century, stagnated and in some regions declined. Archaeological evidence shows reduced trading activity at English ports in the years following 991. The agricultural economy also suffered. Viking raids targeted the harvest season deliberately. Burning crops, killing livestock, and driving farmers from their fields created food shortages. Maldon occurred in August, harvest time. The disruption in Essex meant reduced yields that year. Multiply this across England as Vikings raided more aggressively after learning England would pay, and you get widespread agricultural stress. Famines were rare, but hunger was common in the decade following Maldon. King Ethelred's reign, already troubled before Maldon, became increasingly desperate afterward. He was called Ethelred Unrayed, meaning poorly advised, though later centuries mistranslated this as unready. The name reflected contemporary judgments that his decisions consistently made situations worse. After Maldon, his policy became almost entirely reactive, paying Vikings when they threatened, occasionally raising armies that accomplished little, cycling through advisors who couldn't solve the fundamental problem that England lacked the military capacity to defeat large Viking forces. Ethelred did attempt some military reforms after Maldon. He tried to build a fleet to intercept Viking ships before they landed. This fleet was expensive, requiring shipbuilding expertise England didn't really possess, and mostly ineffective. English ships were slower and less manoeuvrable than Viking longships. When they did catch Vikings, English crews often lost the naval battles because Vikings were simply better at ship-to-ship fighting. The fleet consumed enormous resources for minimal results. Ethelred also tried reorganising the food system to create more reliable military forces. He decreed that certain thanes had to provide fully equipped warriors rather than just showing up themselves. He attempted to standardise weapons and training. He appointed new ealdormen to replace those killed or disgraced, hoping fresh leadership would improve military performance. These reforms were undermined by the kingdom's deteriorating financial situation and by the fact that everyone remembered Maldon. No amount of administrative reorganisation could erase the psychological impact of that defeat. The political fragmentation of England accelerated after Maldon. Ealdormen and regional lords, seeing that the king couldn't protect them, began making their own arrangements. Some negotiated separate peace agreements with Vikings, essentially paying local Danegeld to spare their territories. Others built private armies loyal to themselves rather than the king. England remained nominally united under Ethelred, but in practice it was fragmenting into competing power centres, each trying to survive by whatever means necessary. This fragmentation made England even more vulnerable to Viking conquest. When Svein Forkbeard of Denmark launched his invasion in 1013, he faced no unified English resistance. Different regions made separate decisions about whether to fight or submit. Most chose submission, having learned from Maldon and subsequent battles that fighting Vikings usually meant losing. Sweyn conquered England with remarkable ease, the result of 2 decades of English demoralisation beginning at Maldon. The Danish conquest under Sweyn and his son Nut represented the final consequence of Maldon. The battle itself didn't cause the conquest, but it started the psychological and political collapse that made conquest possible. If Byrhtnoth had held the causeway, if he had won decisively, would England's trajectory have changed? Possibly. A victory might have deterred future raids, demonstrated English military competence and avoided the first Danegeld payment. But history doesn't offer alternative timelines. We only know what did happen. Maldon was lost, Danegeld was paid, and England eventually fell to Viking rule. The cultural memory of Maldon persisted through the Danish conquest and beyond. Even under Danish kings, the poem about the battle continued to be copied and studied. Interestingly, the Danes didn't suppress it. The poem praised courage and loyalty, values Vikings shared. That English warriors died bravely fighting Vikings actually resonated with Viking culture. The poem became a shared cultural artifact, admired by both the conquered English and their Danish rulers for celebrating universal warrior virtues. When Edward the Confessor restored the Anglo-Saxon royal line in 1042, Maldon remained in cultural memory as the beginning of England's troubles. Edward's reign was marked by nostalgia for the pre-Viking invasion period, when England was strong and independent. Maldon represented the moment that strength began to fail. Poets and chroniclers of Edward's reign explicitly connected Maldon to the disasters that followed, constructing a narrative where Byrhtnoth's defeat began England's descent into conquest. The Norman conquest of 1066 added another layer to Maldon's significance. After the Normans defeated Harold Godwinson at Hastings, English writers reflected on their military history, trying to understand why England kept losing to invaders. Maldon appeared in these reflections as a warning about pride and tactical stupidity. Byrhtnoth's Offermod became a cautionary tale. Don't let pride override tactical sense. Don't seek glorious death when strategic retreat serves better. These lessons came too late to help at Hastings, where Harold also made questionable tactical decisions, but they influenced how later generations thought about warfare. The preservation of the Maldon poem itself is miraculous and tragic. The single manuscript containing it survived through the medieval period, copied by monks who recognised its literary and historical value. It passed through various libraries and collections until ending up in the Cottonian Library in London, one of the most important manuscript collections in England. In 1731, fire damaged the library, and the Maldon manuscript was burned. Not completely destroyed, but damaged enough that the beginning and end were lost forever. What survived, copied before the fire by scholars who recognised the manuscript's fragility, was the middle section, 325 lines of the original poem. This preservation through disaster mirrors the poem's theme. The poem itself survived incompletely, damaged but not destroyed, just as Byrhtnoth's reputation survived defeat. The battle was lost, but its memory remained. The warriors died, but their names lived on. The poem's physical damage from fire parallels the battle's violence, both leaving scars but not erasing meaning. Modern scholars work with a fragmentary text about a fragmentary historical event, trying to reconstruct what happened from incomplete evidence. The archaeological investigation of the Maldon battlefield began in the 20th century and continues today. Metal detectorists and archaeologists have found weapons, armour fragments, and personal items that confirm the battle's location and intensity. A Viking sword recovered from the site showed combat damage, the blade notched and bent from striking shields and armour. English spearheads were found with tips broken off, evidence of the savage close combat. These physical artefacts connect modern people to that August morning in 991, when men killed each other over land and honour and treasure. The site of Northey Island itself has changed little in 1,000 years. The causeway still floods at high tide and emerges at low tide, exactly as it did in 991. Visitors can walk where the Vikings crossed and stand where Byrhtnoth made his fatal decision. The island is owned by the National Trust and managed as a nature reserve, peaceful and quiet except for bird calls. It's difficult standing there to imagine the violence that transformed this tranquil landscape into a killing ground. But that disconnect between peaceful present and violent past defines all historical battlefields. Modern commemorations of the Battle of Maldon include an annual ceremony where locals gather at the causeway to remember the fallen. There's a statue of Byrhtnoth in Maldon town centre, depicting him as a heroic warrior, sword raised, defiant even in defeat. The town's museum has exhibits about the battle, displaying replica weapons and armour, explaining the tactical situation, and presenting the poem's text in both Old English and modern translation. These commemorations keep the battle alive in public consciousness, ensuring that Byrhtnoth and his warriors aren't forgotten. The academic study of Maldon spans multiple disciplines. Historians analyse it for insights into late Anglo-Saxon military capacity and political dynamics. Literary scholars study the poem as an example of heroic literature and early English poetry. Linguists examine it for evidence of how Old English was evolving in the late 10th century. Archaeologists investigate the battlefield for physical evidence. Anthropologists use it to understand warrior culture and concepts of honour. The battle's interdisciplinary appeal ensures continuous scholarly attention. recent historical interpretations of Maldon have emphasized its context within broader patterns of Viking activity and English response. Rather than seeing it as an isolated disaster caused by one man's pride, modern scholars view it as part of a systemic problem. England's military organisation in the late 10th century was inadequate for defending against professional Viking armies. The Fyrd system worked for local defence and small raids, but couldn't sustain prolonged campaigns against large forces. Byrhtnoth's defeat reflected these structural weaknesses as much as any personal failing. The comparison between Maldon and other battles of the Viking Age reveals both commonalities and unique features. Many battles followed similar patterns: shield walls clashing, prolonged combat, one side breaking when its leader fell. What made Maldon distinctive was the poem preserving it in such detail, and the household warrior's decision to die rather than flee. Most battles ended with the losing side routing and being slaughtered during flight. Byrhtnoth's men chose to stay and die, making Maldon unusual in its stubborn resistance despite certain defeat. The legacy of the warrior culture displayed at Maldon extended far beyond the battle itself. The values it represented, loyalty unto death, courage in face of defeat, honour above survival, these became foundational to English and later British military identity. From the charge of the Light Brigade to the defence of Rorke's Drift to the Battle of Britain, British military culture has celebrated glorious last stands and stubborn resistance. This tradition arguably begins at Maldon, where Bertwald declared that courage must increase as strength diminishes, establishing the template for British martial identity. The Viking perspective on warrior culture was similar but not identical. Vikings valued courage and loyalty, but also cunning and pragmatism. A Viking warrior who fled to fight another day wasn't necessarily disgraced if he achieved later victories. The Viking sagas celebrate tricksters and survivors as much as heroes who died fighting. This cultural difference might explain why Vikings didn't memorialise Maldon in their own poetry. For them, it was just another victory, tactically successful but not particularly meaningful. The English obsession with the battle might have seemed strange to Vikings who valued results over symbolic gesture. The economic legacy of Maldon, specifically the Danegeld it initiated, had long-term consequences for English state development. The need to collect large amounts of silver quickly forced improvements in tax collection and financial administration. England developed one of the most efficient tax systems in medieval Europe, partly because Danegeld required it. This administrative capacity would later enable Norman rulers to govern effectively, giving England advantages that contributed to its eventual development as a major power. So Maldon's financial burden had the ironic effect of strengthening English state capacity, even as it impoverished the kingdom short-term. The religious interpretation of Maldon also evolved over centuries. Early monks saw it as Christians fighting heathens, a religious war. Later medieval writers, living under Christian Danish rulers, downplayed this aspect and emphasized universal warrior values. Post-Reformation Protestant writers revived the Christian versus pagan interpretation, using Maldon as evidence of English religious virtue. Catholic writers sometimes criticize Byrhtnoth for worldly pride conflicting with Christian humility. Each generation reinterpreted the battle through its own religious concerns, making Maldon a mirror reflecting changing English religious identity. The poem's literary influence extended beyond historical commemoration. Its style influenced later Anglo-Saxon poetry and continued to influence English literature after the Norman conquest. The alliterative verse form, the use of formulaic phrases, the focus on individual warriors' speeches and actions, these became conventions in English heroic literature. Medieval writers composing about other battles borrowed from Maldon's structure and language. The poem helped establish what English heroic poetry should sound like. Modern English literature continues to reference Maldon. J.R.R. Tolkien, who studied Old English professionally, drew inspiration from the battle for scenes in The Lord of the Rings. The defence of Helm's Deep and the last stand at the Black Gate echo Maldon's themes of hopeless courage and resistance unto death. Other fantasy writers have similarly borrowed from Maldon, making it an indirect influence on modern popular culture. Most readers don't know. They're encountering echoes of a 1,000-year-old Anglo-Saxon battle when they read modern fantasy. But the influence is there. The broader question of whether Byrhtnoth's decision was right or wrong continues to generate debate among military historians. Some argue that honour sometimes requires tactically disadvantageous choices, that maintaining warrior culture's values justified accepting higher casualties. Others maintain that commanders have a duty to win regardless of honour concerns, that Byrhtnoth's choice was indefensible military malpractice. This debate reflects modern tensions between utilitarian and deontological ethics, between consequentialist thinking that judges actions by results and virtue ethics that judges actions by the values they express. In the final analysis, the Battle of Maldon matters not because it was militarily decisive, it wasn't, but because it crystallised cultural values that shaped English identity for centuries. The poem's preservation of that August morning in 991 gave England a founding myth of stubborn courage in defeat. Every nation needs such myths, stories that define who its people aspire to be. For England, Maldon provided that story. Byrhtnoth and his household warriors became exemplars of English character, their last stand a template for how to face overwhelming odds, with courage rather than despair. Whether that myth was historically accurate or tactically wise mattered less than its cultural power. The shield walls that clashed at Maldon cast shadows that extended across centuries, shaping how English warriors thought about honour, courage, loyalty, and death. Those shadows touch the present day whenever people face adversity and choose to stand rather than retreat, to fight rather than surrender, to maintain values even when maintaining them guarantees defeat. Beorhtwald's speech about courage increasing as strength diminishes became England's creed, and it all began on that muddy causeway where an old ealdorman made a choice that defined a nation.